Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Ultimate Human Experience podcast. You already know who it is. It is your girl, Rashida, aka Righteous Sun. And on today's episode, we are very blessed to have Seth from the Hira Collective, as well as the visionary and founder, Rima. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share. And yes, please share with family and friends and those who you feel will vibe with this message. With that being said, let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming on for another episode. This one I'm really excited to talk about. I love to hear this discussion and where everybody's perspectives are. This one, we're going to be really talking about reclaiming our ancestral ways of healing. And to help us do that, we have the wonderful Seth. Hi, Seth. How are you doing today?
Good. I'm doing well, thank you.
We also have Rima, the visionary and founder of the Hira Collective. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm excited for our conversation today. I'm
Yeah.
excited to talk about the importance of honoring our ancestral lineage and honoring the ancestral ways of healing.
Yes, I totally agree with you. And before we begin, I would love for all of us, all the listeners, to get to know another practitioner that is a part of the Hira Collective, Seth. So please, I hand it over to you, Seth, to please share to everyone your gifts and what you offer to the world.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to, share a little bit about what I do, and I believe in different souls having different powers, and I think everybody has a certain power that they can tap into. Uh, I think I have been blessed over time to have come to recognize that my soul's power is to be able to make other people feel calm. I think that's my sort of gift that I can offer to people. And that's essentially what I offer in terms of my practice. It's whether it's through yoga, whether it's to meditation. Those are my primary tools of being able to offer this feeling of having your nervous system down regulate. I think, including myself, I lived for a long time with a very activated nervous system, very much sort of frenzied was the word I would use to describe it. And I think when I discovered yoga and meditation back in 2008, I I didn't know it at the time, but I knew I had found something that was very profound for me, and I felt the effects. And it's been one of those things that even when I've tried to be like, yeah, yoga is kind of whatever, it's always come back into my life, and it took me a little bit of time to really understand and accept that, okay, yeah, this is where I'm supposed to be. I can't just keep pushing this away.
So I think that you and I probably met around that time, right? Or just before that when you had started yoga. And I have to say, like, even when I talk about you, because I do, when Rashida and I were kind of like looking at like who signed up for this, I had said like, oh, Seth is like a beautiful soul. And those were my exact words to you, Rashida, right? Like, and I think that's it. I think you like hit it on the spot when you said about like you bring calm. And I think that's why I feel that like, oh my gosh, such a beautiful soul, because I feel so incredibly calm around you. And um yeah, and I'm just really grateful for you to be here and like and just be part of the Hira Collective. So for all our listeners, Seth was the first practitioners part of the Hira Collective. And I love to cheer that on because it's true. And
That's
and
awesome.
not only do you bring the calm, but you see the beauty in others. And you let them see the beauty in themselves. Like you always validate how they feel. And I've always felt that around you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So, Seth, I want to ask you in terms of like yoga. I mean, we're both brown skin, and I think that there's like this stereotype, right? Well, yoga is part of like your ancestral roots. And you talked a little bit about how like you've always kind of come back to it. So, tell us a little bit about how you do honor your ancestral roots in your daily life. And what does that look like? Or what does that connection to you look like with your ancestral lineage?
So I do have somewhat of a regular and consistent practice of yoga and meditation. I think both of those things I have made a part of my life enough that I can lean on them anytime I need to, and it's also just a consistent part of my life. So I think I'd say the simplest answer to that, of how I connect with my ancestral roots, is through the practice of yoga and meditation. It's an interesting kind of story if I can share quickly about how yoga actually came into my life. Um, so I was very much so I love Indian classical music or Hindustani classical music. And there's an instrument in that which is called tabla, which is a percussion instrument. It's a two percussion instrument that you sit down on the floor and you're supposed to, sit cross-legged and play. And I went to, because I love that style of music, I actually wanted to learn to play the tabla. So I went to take my first ever lesson. And I went to the teacher's house and he's sitting on the floor and he's like, okay, like there was a set of tabla in front of him. He's like, okay, sit and let's practice. And I sat down and my knees were like up here. I just couldn't sit cross-legged because I'd left India when I was young, and growing up here, you kind of sit in the chairs all the time. So you don't really have that habit of sitting on the floor. And at least I didn't. I'd lost that. So my teacher, he looked at me and he's like, before you learn this instrument, and he like pointed to my body, he's like, you got to figure out your own instrument.
Wow.
And I was in my early 20s at that point. That was probably like 2021. And I had sciatica, I had knee pain, I had all sorts of issues that you don't think like an early 20s person will have, but I did. And it was around that time that sort of I was looking for something to shift me into a different way of being. And that's kind of how yoga came to me. And it was, yeah, through that I found healing in my body, and I was able to, you know, feel much better and more functional day to day. I never went back to learn the tabla, full disclosure, but I can sit cross-legged now.
That's awesome. I love that. I love that.
Yeah,
Rashid,
I love what you, go ahead.
no, you go ahead. I was gonna ask you. I was gonna ask you what you thought.
Oh no, go ahead. I love that you talked about that. I got into yoga in 2006 when I was pregnant with my son, and I was working like a desk job, and my mom just suggested, why don't you just try yoga? Like I was having back pain. It was like my first child, and I was like, oh, okay, let me give this a try. But it was like the best experience I had ever had. And it was down like we're in Toronto, but I know we have listeners all over the world. But it was in Toronto, like Yonge and Eglinton. And I'll never forget walking in there and then coming out feeling like I had just left a spa. And yet it was just, me doing stretches, but it was something that I looked forward to. And then from then, it really guided me into continuing that practice. Um, I used to teach kids in TDSB as well because I thought there's so much benefits for myself that I was like, everybody should be experiencing this. And so, yeah, very relatable, especially too with meditation, which also I got into after having my son. You don't realize how much external noise and distractions are around you because you've become so accustomed to it. And depending on how you've grown up, but just those moments of sitting quietly would just help to ground me. And at that time, I
Mhm.
didn't even really know too much about meditation. It was really just something of me sitting quietly and realizing like I'm hearing something and yet nothing all at the same time. And that was something that intrigued me. And I know you have a small child. I'll just remember that like Marcus was young at the time, but every time he would go to bed at an early time, which is not how it is now, I would look forward to having that quiet time of just sitting quietly and having all the lights low. Yeah, I'm learning
It's
now
awesome.
active meditation as well. I have to flip it over to active meditation. But yes, thank you for sharing.
Mhm.
I'd actually read the book Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda.
So
Yeah.
that's part of my story. I didn't tell that part, but that's
Yeah, share
hilarious.
though,
That
please tell us.
No,
Like,
please go ahead. I will, but please go ahead.
yeah, so I actually, just kind of like stumbled on this book. And then I was looking for yoga teacher training. I was in like this like up leveling in my life, I guess. It was about 11 years ago now. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I wanted to do yoga teacher training in California. And so I found this ashram like in California. And then I was like, oh wait, this is actually like the Ananda Institute. That's actually Paramahansa Yoga, like Nanda's like way of teaching. And that's actually where I went to learn to get my teacher qualification. So, and you know, the journey for me to yoga was really on a quest to reconnect to my ancestral roots, right? And I think in this Western world, I was like taught that, you know, yoga came through India and through Indian people, and not having that level of connection to India because I'm Sindhi, and Sindhis were displaced from Pakistan. And so we don't really have a land, and like beyond my great grandfather, I don't know what our like family roots are, right? So I think that yoga for me came to like wanting to connect to like me or what's supposed to be. And you know, we now know yoga doesn't just come from India, it comes from many parts of the world and lots of different places. But that was actually really my journey. And so my yoga teacher training helped me understand my body. And it wasn't about like a particular land or a particular people. It was really about like who those ancestors are is irrelevant of skin color, but just like that connection to spirit. That's what it was for me. It was like this like connection to spirit while I'm in my body, while I'm in that practice. And it wasn't just like about what's on the mat, but what I take like as I move forward, and how that shows up and how I show up. But yeah, Seth, I want to hear
absolutely.
you and your story about like that book.
Yeah, it's so it was around the same time that I was sort of, you know, going through this phase of like trying to figure out my body, and I got introduced to yoga. And then a few months later, it was my uncle who had come to live with us at the time, and him and I were talking, and he said to me, he's like, oh, like, you know, you really need to read this book, because I was telling him that, well, I'm just getting into yoga and stuff. And so he's like, oh, you need to read this book. And it was the very next day that I was walking through Ryerson, which is now TMU, but at the time it was Ryerson. I was walking through Care Hall, the lobby, and there was like a book drive happening, and there was a big, massive bin, probably like 1,000 books in there, and it was one of those like disposal bins full of books. And I was like, you know, I love books. I peek inside, and I kid you not, literally the book right on top, Autobiography of Yogi, and I still have that copy. I'm actually, funny enough, I'm rereading it right now. It's upstairs.
I
Um,
was gonna say we'll all break it out.
That's
Yeah.
hilarious. You know, I actually I was like, oh yeah, I'm in the midst of, so I've been trying to find a bit more discipline in my life around how I approach my sleep habits. So I've been very strict about not bringing my phone near my bed. So I keep a book that I'm excited about, so that it just naturally sort of helps me to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to read. So yeah, I'm in the midst of rereading that book right now, and it's yeah, it's one of those things, and I think you know, I think I'm a big believer, and like similar to you, Rima, like my part of my family comes from what is now Peshawar, and which is in Pakistan. So I don't really have any idea. Like I hear stories about like, oh, back in, you know, Peshawar, your family had this and that, or whatever the story is, but like I have no connection to it. So for me, you know, getting to be a part of, you know, getting to be a yoga teacher is sort of my way of connecting with my ancestry, right? It's because I can't necessarily go back and connect with my family, because it's so dispersed, and you know, all the tragedies that happen, a lot of people, you know, just aren't there. The history has been erased. But being able to connect with a practice that is so ancient
Mm,
and so rooted in, you know, in I think I'm not a religious person, but I think culture
mhm.
is a big part of our identity.
Yeah.
And I think yoga has a certain connection to a culture that I really resonate with. And you know, I derive a certain amount of identity from that. So there's a deep connection that I feel to the practice.
Yeah. Rashida, you and I were talking too, right? About just like how do we, you know, make or explore that connection beyond what we know. And you were talking a lot about like you and your husband talk a lot about that, right? With your own personal.
Yeah. It's interesting. You know, when you are, I would say, either starting your journey or you just happen to like in some way stumble. Like I love how every each one of your stories, it just stumbled onto that book. It's no different than mine. It wasn't the book I was looking for, but it's the one that I ended up finding. And I was able to really take a lot of what was in that book and like put it into practice and really learning how to be present, right? And I would say too that like whether you have kids or you don't, but like what does that look like for you as you continue to get older and how you want to share your story? I have learned over time just through like speaking with so many different people is that like I would say back in the day I put a lot of pressure on what stories were told to me and how I could shift and change that to like align with where I was going, even though it was like those before me had a certain way of doing things. And yes, that was taught to us. And we were like, okay, yes, we realize that those particular things have been passed on. And then like we just start to move and act in those same similar ways. And then I had children and that like changed. I thought it was supposed to be this way. And then you have kids and you're like, no, like I think I actually wanted to look different and be different. And yet you still have the pressures of those who are looking over you saying, are you doing it the way that mom did it or the way that grandma did it? Even though I have like no connection to my grandmother, she passed away before I was born. So I can only just take little bits and pieces. But I'll never forget having a moment with my partner where he was like, why do we allow so much of what our parents have placed on us? Why do we hold on to that and make it like our identity when we have this opportunity of two people coming from two different, you know, families and ways of living and creating our own? And I was like, I never thought that way. I always thought like if I'm not living up to my ancestral ways, which I had no idea what that was. So it was really just me looking to my mom and saying, like, well, she did things like this, so I should do it the same. And then him feeling that same pressure. And then for a moment, like we'll never forget us going on this walk together and realizing like we don't have to take on all of what they experienced. We can create our own experiences. What does that
Mhm.
look like? Especially because like he didn't have a great upbringing in terms of like his parents weren't together, my parents weren't together. So we had these different expectations of what a family was supposed to look like, different expectations of what parenting was supposed to look like. That we were like, it would be so nice, like a weight off of your shoulders to be able to say, I understand that I might take bits and pieces, but how can I transform that for it to be something that works for us, that can we can translate to our children?
And I think it's difficult too, right? Like Seth and I were talking about, and I hear it from you, in our conversations too, but like the family tree, right? Like, we're trying so hard to preserve from our most recent like lineage, right? So like from our parents or our grandparents, but because we don't have anything beyond that, it's like we're trying so hard to make sure that we preserve that, but then we're also looking at that and being like, well, do I even want to? Like there's certain things that just don't make sense for us to pass on, right? And so I know with you, Rashida, it's also difficult with both you and your partner because that family tree beyond, I guess, your grandparents, right, is really difficult to access because of colonization as a result of like, divide and conquer that's kind of taken place in like the communities that both you and your partner are from, right?
Yeah. Um, yeah, especially being from Caribbean descent. But also going back, I went through and did my DNA because I just felt like connecting with other women of color or just people of color. I realized like, at that time, I didn't even think it was important, to be honest. And then meeting other people, I'm like, oh, I feel like this is important because now I have children who are looking to me to find answers and connecting the dots a little bit and wanting to know more. And I was like, I want to be able to give them something, but what can I give them? Only to have the opportunity to do a DNA test and realize that I have all of my African roots are with Ghana, Ivory Coast, like Nigeria, something my mom had no idea. And every time she would go back to Barbados, it was like having to be a super sleuth to try to find different things to even just connect the dots for herself. And for my dad, I had really like nothing to go off of. So to be able to find those pieces, and for my partner as well, who is half Indigenous, half white, and to connect to those pieces for himself I can see, and honestly, just the other day, he went to see his aunt, and she was able to give him all these pictures of his father when they were on the reserve from the 50s and like before that. And you're like, just looking at them was such a beautiful thing because honestly, like he doesn't really have that many pictures of his dad and his family from before. A lot of that is on the reserve. And like what you said, a lot of it has been erased. So to even have those moments of just a piece of a picture, something to build some connection, you could almost tell like energetically there was like a shift that happened. Our kids had an opportunity to look at their grandfather, who they also didn't get the opportunity to meet, but also know that like it's there, it still runs within them, and they were intrigued by it. So yeah, those things I start to realize do help to at least continue to build that foundation, even though the roots are starting to like reroot and move in different ways, but still being able to create this stability that we can still build upon of what they had before. Even though it's going to look different, it's something where it's like, oh, we can still take a little piece of everything and be able to continue to plant and grow new things that we can harvest and give to the next generation.
Yeah, it really makes me think of what Seth was just saying, right? Seth, you were saying how like yoga is really so part of your identity, like you reconnecting to that. And I just want to like honor all three of us here, right? And like that journey that we've each had to take to like reconnect to parts of us that we didn't know how to access because
Mhm.
of erasure, right? Quite honestly, because of erasure. Um, and I love how you put that, right, Rashida, how like we're rerouting. Like this is almost like we're rerouting so that we could, your daughter, Seth, and like your children, Rashida, have longer, like they've got more to look through whereas we didn't, right? And to like, so we're reconnecting in the ways that we know how so that they can kind of connect to that as well. Um, yeah, no, I love that. I don't know, Seth, if you wanted to jump in with anything that you want to share that about how that like impacts, how you raise your daughter or how you connect with how, how connecting with your roots has been so important in your parenting.
Yeah, I think as I became a dad, I was very much aware of being able to, I think about soft clay, right? And I think, you know, being able to have soft clay, you can mold it, you can shape it, you can make it something new, right? And I was passed down a certain style of parenting, or at least I witnessed a certain style of parenting. Um, and there was parts of it that I thought, really worked, and I was really thankful for them, and I took them, and I'm like, I'm going to take that, I'm going to, put this into this clay. Parts of it that I didn't really agree with, and I really saw, becoming a parent as an opportunity to not just necessarily be like, well, that happened to me, so I'm going to do the complete opposite. Because I think sometimes there's that sort of knee-jerk reaction as well, which I didn't want to do. So I really tried to understand what it is about the things that I didn't necessarily agree with. What were those things that I could perhaps heal within me? And then from that place of healing, how could I make a choice that felt like the right choice and not just the opposite choice?
Right.
Right. I think that for me, that distinction felt important. And I think, as like my even though my partner and I were both of South Asian heritage, we don't speak the same language because, as you probably know, like India as a identity as a nation state was never really a thing. It was just a collection of kingdoms, and because of that, there's no real one language that's spoken throughout the country. So you can be from India, quote unquote, but you don't speak the same language, and that's the case for my partner and myself. So at home, we actually don't speak in our native languages as much. We speak mainly in English because that's how my partner and I communicate. So I've been really trying to make a concerted effort of trying to share language. And the way that I do that is through music. I love songs. I love, Hindi music. Um, so as much as I can, I try to introduce her to, again, like I said, culture, right? I think language is another way of being able to share culture with somebody, and I think it's one of the easiest ways I find just to be able to sing, and thankfully she doesn't mind my singing, so she'll sort of ask me to sing certain songs, and so that's how I try to connect culture obviously food and stuff like that is a big part of it as well. But I think just in terms of, because I think there's something about having access to a language that is almost like it gives you the tools to then go deeper later in life if you want to. Like that's how I kind of look at it. I'm not necessarily going to share everything, about India and about the rich history, but if I can give her the ability to understand and then go deeper, and just kind of plant seeds. Like it's planting seeds and then watering them, and over time, she can then choose to go with it where she wants to.
Yeah, I love that. As you were talking, you mentioned food, right? And I think food is such a big part. Like for me, there's this one dish that my family makes called Cindy curry. And and every time I eat it, like I think of my grandmother because she used to make it all the time. But I think of like, as I'm eating and I'm like, my grandmother ate this and she learned this from her mom. And like how that like recipe got kind of passed down, and
Hmm.
it's so healing, right?
Hmm.
It feels so healing to know that we're like connected through this like food or this like language or like this way of being. And like for me, dance is really big in my life. I dance before I could walk is what my mom always says, right? And so I think of like my ancestry. Like I know my grandmother danced, um and I just feel so connected when I participate in those things. And for me, like that connection to that ancestry through culture, it just feels very healing. It feels very connected. It doesn't feel like so isolated, which I think that I can feel a lot, being um being a settler in this country.
Yeah, I like how you said that. That connection piece. I want to ask a question to all of you. How do you find that, just like what you said, Rima, when you're talking about the dance, and Seth, you're talking about the food, do you have any connection through your culture and your ancestors through spirituality and how they connected to spirit, to the world of spirit? How did you find, like, you as like a yoga teacher, even both of you, like, I could say me as a psychic and doing the healing work as an intuitive guide and Reiki, I had no connection prior to. I just knew that like I could sense these energies. My sister could also do the same, but we never spoke about it. And then I, out of the blue, decide to go in this path, and they're like, "This is very different than what we're used to." And I'm like, well, I just feel guided towards this. And it was only like maybe 2 years ago where I was in like a mediumship program and we were doing practices, and someone connected and came through. And I don't know anything about my, like, anybody honestly about my family. And they had mentioned an aunt who lived in Nova Scotia. And at that time, I didn't even know I had family who lived in Nova Scotia. But I was like, you know what? Thank you for all of this information. I'm going to go back to my mom and ask her, if she can validate. And she was able to validate that I had an Aunt Ruby who lived in Nova Scotia who also did this work. And I said, well, at that time, my mom wasn't giving too much information, but I was like, do you know what kind of work it was? And she was like, oh, it's something a little funny, like, I'm not sure, but people would come to her back door and she would heal them and give them different plant medicines and things like that. And I'm like, okay, like it makes sense now as to why I've been guided in this direction. It wasn't something that just came out of nowhere, but it was something that was already there with my ancestors and perhaps before that. So, do you find for yourselves just going into this healing journey and practices that you do and sharing your light with others that you feel like you've received that from those who came before you, even though it was something that like had to be tucked away and hidden at a certain point in their lives?
That's a really good question. Um, I don't know if I have any familial roots that I can point towards. I know that, I mean, that's, I know my parents were and still are very much like they're both meditators, they're both into, and they're both, trained in yoga that trained with Baba Ramdev back in the day. Um, so it was something that I kind of felt was just around me. It's not something that I necessarily ever thought of as like, and I'll say something really quickly about this. This is something that, like, to me, like growing up, yoga was just something that you do, right? It was never a thing that you have to buy clothes for, and then buy a mat for, and then buy a water bottle for, and then go to a place and buy a membership for, and then go do that thing there, right? So that whole thing really, and to this day, I still struggle with that. Um, and even as I say that, I can feel that resistance inside me. Um, I just grew up, you go to a park in India at 6 in the morning, people are doing yoga, right? There's no selfies. People are just doing yoga, right? And that's the truth. Like that's not an exaggeration. So to me, like that is how I sort of connected with the practice. Um, Even for me, my first 6 years of being a yoga practitioner, I never owned a yoga mat. I went to India. I worked with someone one on one on Juhu Beach, 5 days a week, and we would just meet up in the morning, do yoga. He would guide me, and that was it. That was like if you want to put, it's like a guru shishya like relationship, but there was no exchange. There was no that. It was just understanding that this is what you know. But that's not how yoga is accessed here in the West. So I think, to me, I just kind of felt like it was always around me. I just never really realized how much it actually was a part of me until one day I was like, wait a minute, like this is a part of me. You know what I mean? Like it took me, especially, and I think, and to go, culturally, like in India, it was a part of my lifestyle, and like it was very much accepted. But here, especially, I would say like 12, 13 years ago, 15 years ago, guys doing yoga was kind of a funny thing. People, like, I remember the first time I like started doing yoga, someone was like, dude, that's for girls, right? And like literally someone said that comment to me because I was doing some yoga stretches in the gym, and I was like, 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 are you serious right now? Like, you know what I mean? And it's so funny to me because, again, there's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's just funny because historically, in the South Asian, in the Indian context, yoga has been passed down generally from men to men, right? It's very much a patriarchal lineage of yoga. I'm not saying that's right, but you come here and it's almost the complete opposite,
Yeah.
right? And so part of the reason why, pardon me.
And it's sexualized, right?
Absolutely, right? Absolutely, it's sexualized. And so part of the reason why I became a yoga teacher was because I wanted to actually see representation for South Asian men in the yoga space, because that really is not a thing. I don't know any other yoga instructors who are South Asian men, right? I just don't. And I'm sure they're out there, but I don't know any, right? And to kind of riff off of your point, Rima, like initially when I became an instructor, I had this whole thing that I was like, oh, I got to be on Instagram, and I would travel around the world and do cool yoga poses, shirtless yoga poses, and all that kind of stuff. And like as time went on, I kind of started to feel less and less interested in doing that, and that part of my practice, or that part of my like business, if you want to call it that, felt more and more disingenuous. And I realized that, like, wait, something that is to me a journey inward, something that helps me connect with myself, my breath, my body, my mind, bring them all into like one sort of unit. I'm turning that into this externalized image, which is very much about how I look and how the pose looks and how, oh, look, I'm in this like cool place in the world, right? So it just felt so disconnected from what the practice actually meant for me. And that was like, that's probably going back now 4 or 5 years ago. And if you like on my Instagram, there's a very clear sort of like divide between pre this realization and what the content looked like, and post that. And I just kind of was like, no, I'm not going to do this anymore, because it just felt like I had adopted the Western style of promoting yoga, and it didn't resonate with me. And I realized that like the thing that actually like resonated with me was letting it just be something that I do without it being advertised or made to look a certain way.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that, right? Because I think before I found the book autobiography of a yogi, yoga was like hot yoga, and like, what you like, wearing little tops and like tight pants. And so I would go and I would feel gross after, if I'm being honest. Like I just felt
Hmm.
like this wasn't, I mean, it was like I was in my 20s, but it was like fun, but not fun. And it felt weird. And I just didn't want to do it, quite honestly. I was like, well, I'm just going to, like, for me, it was like, I just go to the gym or I do my own stretching. And I was really into meditation. But after I found the book, and then, was very selective of where I did my teacher training, it was not about the mat. I like how you said that though. There's a mat and there's a bottle, and then you buy clothes for this practice, right? It was really about being in your body and like really the energy and the practice that I learned it. I didn't get to be on Juhu Beach with another person sharing it with me, but I was really intentional about like where I did that practice because it was so important for me to learn it that way. And much like you, Seth, I think it was all around me too. But I was born and raised here, and my parents, they're the first immigrants in this family, and like life was really tough for them. Like they were not only responsible for me and my brother, but they were also responsible for my dad's entire family. My dad took on this like fatherly role, who he raised his own father and his brothers. He put one through med school. My dad was only like 20 when he came to this country, and my dad and my mom had a huge load on their shoulders. So I think they did their best in terms of like ensuring that we were connected to things. And so, the Bhagavad Gita, or like the Gayatri Mantra was always playing in my house, or like Mahabharata thing was always playing on the TV, or like incense was always being burned. And I think that for me, when, you know, it feels nostalgic, like when I hear the Gayatri Mantra or I light an incense, it's not something that, in this Western world, when you're like in a practice and you're like lighting incense and it's all like sexy and cute. For me, it's actually very nostalgic, right? It's very like
Hmm.
how my parents were so intentional with like helping us connect.
Hmm.
Um, and so, I think the listeners will learn or do already know that like I'm very connected to my maternal grandmother and her brother, as well as my maternal grandfather. And I lost my maternal grandmother. She passed away 9 years ago, and her brother passed away a year ago. And he passed away at 99 years young. And before they both passed away, I actually like recorded videos of them and how, and for me, that was like to make sure like I always had that connection with them. Like I know like spiritually, I feel like I'm always connected. I talk to them quite often, but watching videos of them, like it's so special, and having those like photographs. But I love that. Yeah, I love that question, Rashida, because like how do I connect with them spiritually, and how does that show up in my spirituality? I think it's for me, I think it's through prayer. Like I do find that I do pray, um and check in, like, does this sit right with me? And then I feel supported. And I think you've heard me say this many times before, but like Maya Angelou says, right? Like I stand as one, I come as 10,000. And that's often how I feel when I come out of a meditation or I come out of a prayer, because I'm connecting with me and I'm checking in to say, like, how, like, am I, or am I being supported? And I often leave like a meditation or that connection practice feeling connected to those roots, connected to all those who I don't know what they look like or what they feel or who they are, but I know they're with me. And that's kind of how for me it like shows up in my spirituality or my practice. I was also raised by my mom, especially like, we're not religious, we're very spiritual. And my mom always taught me that like, um, I don't care if you believe in a rock, right? Like, but having some faith or connection. How she explained it to me as a child was actually, I'll just quickly share this with you. This girl at school wouldn't be my friend anymore because I was Hindu and I didn't know what that meant. And so I came home and I'm like, Mom, this girl keeps calling me Hindu, but I'm not Hindu, I'm Rima. And my mom was like, okay, let me talk to you about this. And so she explained to me that humans had created religion like a tree, like a concept of a tree, right? So that trunk of the tree, God, spirit, whatever, is all actually the same, but humans have created different branches of that, but we're all actually connected to that same trunk of the tree. And she explained to me that the roots of that are all interconnected. And so you could choose to believe in this branch or that branch, and that was up to me to choose what I wanted. but she's like, this child, this friend of yours just doesn't know that yet, and she'll learn it at some point, but you show up with love and kindness. Like, there's nothing that you need to say. And I think that always has kind of humbled me, and understanding like my connection with spirit, or like concept of religion or spirituality. It's how I interpret it, or how I've been taught to see it.
Yeah,
That's
thank
really
you.
cool.
Yeah, it's really, I like how you said that, especially with kids, like they don't, like what you said, like you're Rima, you're not thinking all of those extra little pieces. So then do you guys find that your connection has deepened over time in terms of like that, what you were saying, like the importance of it? I mean, because like we all said, we started young, and even before we even got into this work or even connecting inwardly, we were caught up in everyday life of doing things. So like those, just like, you're a teacher and you deal with young students, as well as like we're parents, we deal with the young student, our kids, is that they have those connections, but it's not really there. So like it's no different than our parents telling us stories and we're like, oh, we've heard these stories so many times, like, but we don't really, like, we resonate, but we don't find that deep connection. Do you find for yourself as you get older that you have a deeper connection with the stories and the like ancestral roots that you do have a connection with, or are able to even like have that's come to the surface for you?
Yeah. I have an answer. So I
Yeah,
think
go.
for me, yeah, for me, um, so my birth name is actually not Seth, it's Titpragya. And Stedpragya, some of the listeners might be familiar with the name. It's actually from the Gita. And so my mom named me this name, and Stedpragya, it's in the second chapter. I think it's verse 14, where um, the quick little summary of the Bhagavad Gita for anyone who doesn't know, it's in the middle of a battlefield during the Mahabharata, where Arjun, who was the greatest warrior of his time, his charioteer is Arjun, or his charioteer is Krishna, and Krishna is, in his human form, but he's actually an incarnation of God. And in this battlefield, he's facing his family, his cousins, his uncles, and it's 5 brothers versus 99 of his cousins. And in the first day of the battle, he looks across and sees his uncles, people he grew up with, and he's like, I can't be a warrior with them here. Um, and so Krishna turns and says to him, you are a warrior in this context. That is who you are right now. After the day of battle is over, you can go over, you can bereave with them, you can, show grief. That's when you can be a cousin, a nephew, and whatever else, whatever that role. So sthit pragya, essentially what it means is sthit means stable, and pragya means of knowledge or of the mind. So essentially what it is you're stable in the knowledge of who you are without being attached to any of those roles that you play in life. And this is something I've really sort of internalized and made it a part of how I actually like process the world and process my own like my different roles. And I think having that connection as my birth name has only over time led me to explore more about the Gita. Like I now, find myself looking up, different verses, trying to learn the actual Sanskrit of the Gita, learning more about the Upanishads and the Vedas, and this, what has now sort of become mythologized, which to me is actually history.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's not in the Eurocentric concept of what history is, it's become myth. But I don't think it's myth. It's actually historic events that have real resonance. So I've been on this journey lately of just trying to reconnect with deep antiquity, right? Of more than 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago, because human history is much longer than that. It's just Western civilization doesn't really have record of that, but that's what we're taught in school. So I'm trying to now connect with the Eastern um, records of history and find out what wisdom existed way before.
I love that. I love that. I have a bit of a different response to that. I find that I too am always looking for beyond like how things have been like I don't know, colonized, or how they've been presented, and like teaching me my own histories, and or even erasing it, right? But I think when I think about like how that's evolved for me over time, I don't think it actually has. I mean, as a child, I didn't know my maternal grandfather. He died when my mom was 14. My grandma was very young. She had 5 young kids, and her husband had a heart attack. But for some reason, at a very young age, I felt very connected to him. And so as a child, when we write like Dear Diary, like it's like the little thing that you did as little girls, I never wrote Dear Diary. I wrote Dear Nana. And as a very young kid, I always wrote to Nana. And so I felt this like connection to him, and no one taught me to do that. No one told me about like anything. I just wanted to know who he was. And so I would like be like, "Hey Nana, like today we did this in school," or like, and I felt like he would respond to me, and I felt like it in my heart. And I've always felt like he's protecting me. I actually have a little not little, but it's a tattoo. His name means rose, and it's like right by my heart because I feel him like right like with me all the time. But I think what's evolved for me is the depth of that conversation, right? Like, when I was a kid, I was like, "Hey, Nana, like, this is what I did today at school. We made this like cute little thing, right?" But now it's like, "Hey, Nana, like, am I doing the right thing with the Hira Collective? Hey, Nana, like, is this like, and again, like, we've never met in our physical bodies, but I do feel like that connection, that depth has really gotten there. And, there was a long period of my life, and I would say kind of now where I'm like, where do I belong in my family, right? Like, my family, like I feel like a little bit like out there with my family. And then I remember him, and I remember my grandmother, and I remember my mama, my grandmother's brother. And I'm like, oh right, I do belong in this family. I'm just like them. And so, my nana was an artist. He really believed in like, he really honored the divinity of a woman. He honored, he didn't believe in dowries or like any of that. He had a love marriage with my grandmother, who was 10 years older than him. She was in her like mid 30s when he married her. And he just was such a, I guess, a feminist of that time, but that word didn't exist. And so I feel like, yeah, like that conversation has gotten deeper. I've always felt connected to that. And I've always, when I look at my family, sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I don't belong. I remember that. And I think that's for me, like how that like has evolved. But I love that he's kind of come up in this conversation because I don't often talk about my nana, but I do feel like a very deep connection with him. Yeah.
Thank you. I love how, as we all share our stories, like it's those moments where you have the opportunity to share. The more you share those stories, the more there is an even deeper connection, because you're not just sharing it with yourself, but you get to share it with others. And as we continue to share our stories of those who came before us with others, it's kind of like it continues, right? Those roots then still continue, and they can impact somebody else's life, or perhaps even give way for others to then go back and maybe sit with the connections that they have with their own family, or maybe what they're hopefully looking for um, in the future as they continue. Because I mean, we know family dynamics are so different, so broad, looks different now than it did then. And yet at the same time, it's still like back then it was very different as well as how it is today. So, how do you feel for those who might be in this situation? Because I'm noticing now more than ever, especially with like DNA and ancestry, you have access to those things. That I've heard so many stories of people being able to connect more with other family members around the world. But yet some people are still hesitant to do it. Like, I'll be honest, I never really thought about doing it because it's just something that wasn't like spoken about. But I felt the need to just at least start it in some way to say, okay, well, we're not just from the islands. We came before that. Like, there was something before. I want to know what that is, Mom. Like, even if you are unsure, you're not ready to dive in, at least like let's get the ball rolling here. So what would your advice be to those who might want to connect deeper, like that importance of what you said, of just even hearing the stories or connecting in some way, where now it's not just talking about your day, which can relate very much, Rima. I used to do the exact same thing growing up as a child. And now the conversations are deeper. they're more, I would feel more soul connection that I'm trying to have as I talk to those my ancestors from before. Um, yeah, what would your advice be to others?
I don't know, something Seth said earlier is really coming to me. Like, Seth, you were talking about how, and this may not sound like it's related, but I think for me it does. It's like how it's like an internal job, how it's like how we connect internally. Like you take yoga and it's more of like your relationship with yourself through yoga and then your relationship with your roots, right? As opposed to like showing
Mhm.
up externally. And so, as important as I think my advice to others would be, as important as it might feel that you need to connect with like people out there, I think it's actually really about connecting back to yourself and like,
Mhm.
and that will drive your connection with others. And,
Mhm.
you know, the Hira Collective is all about that, right? It's about how do we honor the ancestral lineages of the modalities that are offered. So if there is modalities or services that may not feel like they're part of your own lineage, but they're part of a practice that, you know, you're really kind of inclined to learn more about or be part of, or, you know, maybe it is yoga with Seth, or like understanding like psychic readings, or, you know, connecting to your angels and whatnot through you, Rashida. Like I think that avenue is there for folks, for our listeners to, you know, search by modality, ailment, or symptom and find a practitioner whom that they might feel like might align with what they're seeking. But I think it really does begin with that connection to self, and then that self brings community, right? Our community and through that community, how do we continuously connect with others who may not be necessarily directly in our lineage, but it can bring connections to stories of our own past, right?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think the only thing I guess maybe I would add to that perhaps is, you know, to get curious, right? I think curiosity is often the thing that leads you to places that you don't really even realize you're seeking. And I think like for me, you know, it was I started reading Swami Vivekananda, you know, several years ago, and then through that, one day I was driving and I saw the Vedanta Society in Toronto, and I was like, oh, I've heard this. This is before like Google Maps and all that, so I was just like, oh, this is so cool. It's like, and that curiosity towards something that had resonated with me on page stayed with me, and then once I, you know, that was a very small example of that curiosity leading to sort of deepen my connection to my roots. But I think, and this is, you know, not possible for everyone, but I was very fortunate that I got to actually go back and live in India for 2 years as an adult, right? Because I lived there as a kid, but then I went back and lived as just a common, you know, Indian person without any family, without any sort of support net. And that's when I really sort of understood on a much deeper level what it means to be someone who is Indian, and you know, and to interact with people who I had no previous connection with. And even though I didn't necessarily like go on a quest to like find out more about myself, but coming out of that, I've since then had a much deeper and stronger connection to my roots that goes beyond the surface level of like, oh, I'm into like Bollywood and cricket and, you know, that kind of stuff. There's a much deeper appreciation for the land and the history that's been there, which is so rich.
Wow, I love that. So folks, if you're looking to connect with, you know, perhaps a modality, perhaps an ancestral way of healing, the Hira Collective is your access point where you can search by modality, ailment, or symptom, to see if that in, you know, using your curiosity of maybe there's another way of healing, maybe there's another way of accessing or understanding womb healing, or if you're, you know, depression or anxiety or whatever mental health, or not that we're doctors here, but there are other ways that you might be able to access things. And so we hope that you know, when we launch in 5 weeks, middle of June, that you're able to find those supports and find that community that can support you in reconnecting with your roots and yourselves.
Yes, thank you so much, Rima. I totally agree with you that you are giving way for other people to have that soul connection, even if they might not know their roots and their ancestors before that, depending on their circumstances. That, like what both of you said, which I loved how you guys added that piece in of just finding the deeper roots. To me, when we're going deeper into the core, now you're touching on the soul. And that to me is something that's so vast and it can look so different for so many people. So it's like, what resonates with your soul? And if you can find people through the Hira Collective, such as Seth, like, thank you so much, Seth, for just even sharing pieces of that. So people get an opportunity to just get to hear your story and like have a deeper connection with you when they decide to book. Like, this is why we do this podcast, is to have the opportunity for people to just get to know the practitioners, get to know their stories and why they even do the work that they do. So very blessed to have you on. And of course, Rima,
My pleasure. Thank you.
always a pleasure to have you on as well. Guys, thank you so much once again. Please remember, I will have all the links and all the information down below. This is the Ultimate Human Experience Podcast. We are out. Peace.